Hey everyone, welcome to a bonus edition of the A-Pod. Fun chats, fun topics, fun people. Usually comes to you every single Wednesday on msgnetworks.com and on iTunes. But for the last several weeks, we've been giving you a special bonus episode every Friday. Also on msgnetworks.com and on iTunes. And it's been a great week. The second round of the playoffs in full swing. If you happen to live in New York City, then please come on down to Rangers Town Square, which is right beside Madison Square Garden. Come say hello. I'll be hosting several events there, interviewing alumni. Sometimes we do giveaways. Sometimes. Can't guarantee when, but they happen. So feel free to stop by. There's a lot of cool stuff to do at Rangers Town Square as well. There's a virtual reality setup where you get to go behind the scenes backstage at Madison Square Garden, see the players warm up, see the locker rooms in virtual reality. It's really cool. There's that. Like I said, alumni. Who's been through there? Let's see. Brian Mullen has been through there. Pete Stemkowski, Adam Graves, Stefan Matteau, Tom Laidlaw. A lot of great names that have worn the Blue Shirts uniform have come through Rangers Town Square to say hello, take pictures, sign autographs, and answer questions. We do some interviews with them as well. So definitely check it out. It's a lot of fun. There's a 360 image, so you can take your picture around the entire Rangers team. There's stalls, which I just found out from one of the employees that they're not called bunks. We call them bunks in Canada, I guess. It's not a word used necessarily in America. It's a stall, where you sit down and change. I used bunk on the mic, and then afterwards, one of the guys came up to me and said, "Hey, is that a Canadian word, bunk?" I guess it is. I was born and raised in Canada. Don't hold it against me, all right? Anyway, so bonus episode of the A-Pod. We've had some great guests. And thanks for checking it out. So like I said, you can check this out on msgnetworks.com and on iTunes. Usually comes out every single Wednesday. Please leave a comment and subscribe on iTunes and leave a 5-star rating. That'll help the algorithm so that other people can find the podcast as well. We want to grow this thing. We want to reach as many people as we can with these amazing conversations and interviews. Wednesday's guest was great, wasn't she? Lacey Mark. She was a contestant on the 21st season of The Bachelor, the latest season. And we get into the inner workings of how that reality show works. How is it filmed? How do contestants get selected? How did she get selected? What was her process like? Flying on location and being filmed virtually 24 hours a day. What is that like? What sort of how are you completely disconnected from the outside world? How do you relate to your fellow castmates? What about the fact that there are a plethora of women vying for the attention of one man? And that's this season. The Bachelorette's the opposite. It's a plethora of men vying for attention of one woman. Like, what is that like? What does that do to the human condition? Like what does that do to a person's mind? I mean, this is all very interesting topics. And she's a very well-educated woman as well. She went to university for a very interesting degree, which we get into in that conversation on Wednesday. It is posted on iTunes and msgnetworks.com. I don't want to give it away here because that is fascinating in itself. So good vibes and positive thoughts as she goes along in her career. Definitely check out that conversation. We also dropped a special bonus podcast yesterday with the Maven. Yes, it has just so happened that I was at MSG Networks on earlier this week. And so was Stan Fischler. And you know what? We said, hey, why don't we record a podcast? Why don't we preview the second round of the playoffs? And why don't we open it up to people to ask you questions, Stan? Because you've been covering hockey for decades upon decades, and you've wrote about 100 books on hockey. So you know a thing or two. Why don't we peek into that hockey brain of the Maven and ask you some questions, past and present? So we did that. And we used the hashtag AskTheMaven on Twitter. We got some questions. We asked them to Stan, and we previewed the second round of the playoffs. Stan gives all of his thoughts and analysis. Of course, he is deep into covering the Rangers right now, so that is where most of his focus is. But he does have a lot of thoughts about the other rounds, first round and second round in the Stanley Cup playoffs, so you can check that out on the A-Pod feed as well on iTunes at msgnetworks.com. So, who is our guest today? This was a conversation I was really looking forward to because I am a big gamer. If you don't know that about me, you do now. I love video games, particularly retro video games. I love the Nintendo Entertainment System. I love Sega Genesis, Super Nintendo, that era of video games, near and dear to my heart. Of course, I'm an 80s kid. That's probably why I grew up on Super Mario Brothers. No surprise. So Blake J. Harris is the author of Console Wars, and this book dives very deep into the battle between Sega Genesis and Super Nintendo in the 90s. That console era was a battle between two major companies, and Nintendo was the established giant coming off the success of the Nintendo Entertainment System from the 80s and Super Mario Brothers 1, 2, and 3 and all the success that they had with all the other famous Nintendo games. And then all of a sudden, here comes Sega roaring through, trying to steal some market share, trying to win the battle, trying to become the console to have. And Sega Genesis really came close, and in fact, at one point, it was in the lead. And basically, this book goes through that entire battle. And obviously, Nintendo came out the winner because they're still around creating consoles. And you see Sega creating games for Nintendo today, which is a huge, like, that just blows your mind. To see a title, like we talked about this with Blake in the podcast, to see video games right now with Super Mario and Sonic the Hedgehog together, games like that exist. Mario and Sonic at the Olympic Games, perfect example. To see that exist today is mind-blowing based on what happened in the 90s, and this book, Console Wars, goes through all of that. Now, the other two reasons why I was really happy to have Blake on the podcast is because he also did a deep dive into NHL 94. And NHL 94 just so happened to win our Ice Madness tournament in March, which you guys voted on to crown the greatest retro ice hockey video game ever. NHL 94 was the winner. A little podcast juice coffee there. Pardon me. So yeah, NHL 94 won, and it just so happens that Blake wrote an 8,000-word blog about the creation of NHL 94. He talked to the producers, he talked to the creative designers, he talked to a lot of people behind the scenes at the time that were working on this game. So we learn a lot about the creation of NHL 94. Why did that game stand the test of time? And also some funny stories about players learning their player ratings. I think NHL 94 was the first year that player ratings were used, and there's a really funny story about a couple of players learning their player ratings for the first time. The last reason, well, actually there's many reasons, but the other major reason is why I'm happy Blake came on the podcast is because he's currently writing a book about virtual reality. And specifically, we talk about how will the consumption of sports be changed forever? How will that paradigm shift now that virtual reality is becoming more prevalent? People might remember VR from the 90s, even Virtual Boy, that's a Nintendo release. It was awful. It just was not a good viewing experience, but that level of comfort has definitely changed. And even at Rangers Town Square, doing that VR experience, it's magnificent. It is something that is, you have to try it. If you've never tried VR today, Oculus Rift and whatever else that is out there today, either come to Rangers Town Square and check that VR experience out, or just try one somewhere, because it's really advanced far, to the point where you experience it and you think, wow, pretty soon we're going to be able to replicate the arena experience. Like, pretty soon I'll be able to put on a pair of goggles and feel like I'm at Madison Square Garden watching a Ranger game or watching a Knicks game or a Liberty game or even a concert. Like, we're close to that. And Blake dives deep into that. He elaborates on what else needs to be done in order for that to be fully replicated, such that that is just becoming part of our viewing habits. So that is our guest, Blake J. Harris. Before we get to that, I want to give a shout out to the Tribeca Film Festival. It's basically taken over the city of New York, and it's a lot of fun. I have to say that I've been to a few movies, a few screenings, did get my press pass. I went to a couple of talks as well. I got to see Kobe Bryant and in conversation with Michael Strahan and Glenn Keane. In fact, Glenn is the son of the man who invented Family Circus, which is amazing. I even tweeted that. It was a snarky tweet, of course. I was like, ha, that's awesome. I'm here to listen to stories from the son of the man who created Family Circus. If you've never read Family Circus before, it's like the most dad joke comic strip of all time, and just go check it out online. It's hilarious. Anyway, so that talk was interesting. It was really cool to see Kobe at peace with his retirement. I know I mentioned this briefly on Wednesday's podcast, but aside from that, got to see the movie Chuck, starring Liev Schreiber as Chuck Wepner, which was a great boxing biopic. I thought actually it was one of the better boxing biopics. It was very well done. I love the way it was shot. I love the treatment of the film itself, like the actual the effect of seeing the film. It had a very retro feel to it, and the ups and downs of Chuck Wepner's life and career were very well captured in this film. So if you're a fan of sports biopics, definitely check out Chuck, because I liked it. I enjoyed it very much, and I recommend it. So I would go out of my way to see Chuck. Liev Schreiber is in it, as I mentioned, as Chuck. So there you go. Let's get to our guest, Blake J. Harris, the author of Console Wars. He wrote a giant blog about NHL 94, and he's currently writing a book on virtual reality. And here it is, our conversation on the A-Pod with Blake J. Harris. So here we are, MSG Network's offices. We're literally sitting in an office right now, heart of New York City, across the street from Madison Square Garden. Across from the table from me right now is Blake J. Harris. He is an author. He has written one of my favorite books from one of my favorite eras and one of my favorite subjects. It's called Console Wars, Sega and Nintendo, and the Battle That Defined a Generation. And it really defined my generation, for sure, because Absolutely. I grew up in that generation of the Nintendo versus Sega wars. So I was in the thick of it, and you were too.
Absolutely. I mean, friendships were made based on what system you had. Mostly it was a matter of, sort of this Democrats and Republicans split of like, you stay with your tribe. But at the same time, I remember, if you were a Sega kid like myself, you wanted to have a Super Nintendo owning friends so that you can try out those games. And also I remember making some friendships that my mom wasn't so approving of, because certain friends knew how to get to various points and levels and to get things in Zelda that I didn't know how to get. So, it really, I half-jokingly have said that video games, for those of us who grew up in the 80s and 90s, was like the social lubricant of the time. Before the internet, before a lot of things that connect people, we had video games, and you wouldn't call up a friend and say, hey, you want to come over and talk about sports, or you want to come over and talk about girls. You'd say, hey, you want to come over and play video games. And then you talk about sports and you talk about girls. But that's really what it was. Video
games first. That's the hierarchy of needs, right? Video games first, yeah. Then sports, then girls.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, it was just, I always was
I love how significant others is third on the list.
I think sixth grade girlfriends don't count that much.
Fair enough. Yeah, good point. And you know what? Like in that generation too, like a lot of younger people listening don't understand the hardships of not being able to look up secrets online.
Yeah.
Right? You didn't have the internet to just look up, how do I beat this level or how do I beat this boss? Even a Game Genie was at a premium, right? Like even like any sort of cheats were at a total premium. And oftentimes, if you didn't beat the level, too bad, you got to start from the beginning. The most frustrating thing ever as a kid.
Yeah, or a lot of the games didn't even save back then. Or I remember games accidentally turning off, or someone would trip over a cord and you have to go back to the beginning.
Oh, that was the worst.
And something like that you kind of forget. Even though it's hard to understand, you can kind of conceptually come to terms with the fact that there wasn't like this vast information superhighway out there, and that you couldn't get access to the information you needed, secret levels, codes, and whatnot. But it also meant that there could be unsubstantiated rumors that just could never be disproven. Like, I remember certain costumes discussed for Mario, and for Mario 3, because there was the frog costume, the Tanuki costume. There was like talk of like an Indian Mohawk costume and all these different things. But you wouldn't, because a friend's cousin got the secret
Really?
thing. And how would you know that this is
Did that
not
ever
true?
get created? Was it like a secret thing in the game, or is it?
I think it was just a made-up rumor. But
it
there
was
was
a
just
made-up
no
rumor,
way
okay.
to like, someone could have said with these hockey games, there's a way to unlock teams from the 1960s. And
right.
You would be like, well, I guess.
I remember when I first unlocked the Hammer Brothers suit in Mario 3 for the first time, it was like my mind was blown. I didn't know that there was anything else in the game. And then suddenly I found the Hammer Brothers suit and it was like, oh my God, this is a whole different game now.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Stuff like that. Yeah, totally. So, okay, one of the big things I wanted to talk with you about, because you are definitely dialed in, particularly with the book, for this generation. And we just did a tournament to crown the greatest retro ice hockey video game of all time. People voted online, and the winner was NHL 94. And
that makes me so happy.
I'm
so happy that the demographic of listeners and fans recognize the brilliance of that game. That that happens to be my favorite game.
So you voted for, I mean, your pick would have been NHL 94 to win the entire thing.
Absolutely.
For sure. Even more than Blades of Steel, Ice Hockey, NHL 95, NHLPA 93.
Yeah, I love that game.
Okay.
Wow. It's obviously, it's very fun. To even just make the tournament, you have to be a fun game. But what I loved about that game, and I once wrote a piece, which I had told you about NHL 94, which turned into this 8,000 word love letter to the series. But that game was just such a beautiful, artistic effort of like combining accuracy and authenticity. So I guess I've never played in a game, so I can't say that it feels like what it's like to be in a game. But there was like a poetry to that game, and it's also one of the only games that I ever played enough to get good at. I'm so bad at video games. That's like my dirty secret, that I write about video games all these years, but I'm so terrible at them. But that's the one that, like, if I had to try to battle my way into heaven or whatever, I would be like, bring on NHL 94.
Why has it stood the test of time, that game?
I think a lot of factors. I think that games from that era, just in general, there's a certain nostalgia for them. So people look back on that time, and through rose-tinted glasses, and just in general. But that game specifically, I do think, if you think about where it came in the timeline, it came out in late '93. That was kind of at the height of the console wars between Sega and Nintendo. So that was probably the point of like the most saturation and excitement around these things. And then also that, the Genesis had been out since 1989, so this was 4 years later. So the developers had 4 years to kind of learn how to program for that console. By the way, I for the piece that I wrote on NHL 94, I spoke with all the producers, and when I said, "Oh, I love NHL 94," they said, "Did you play the Super Nintendo game or the Genesis game?" I said, "The Genesis game." And they said, "All right, good. That's the one that you should be playing." So
Really?
Yeah.
So they rate the Genesis version higher than, because I played the Genesis version.
Yeah, they rated higher. And
really? What were the differences? Why would they say that? Just gameplay?
It's just gameplay, like things that I wouldn't necessarily understand, that you would feel, but it's like they felt like they got the maximum amount out of that game. Because, like we were talking about even before recording, one of the interesting things from that era is that how it was just this race and this challenge to fit as much data and programming into these small spaces as you could. So I guess they felt like they really were able to make the magic work for that.
We're definitely going to dive into that. So that's interesting, because a lot of people would say for many games that were on both platforms, the SNES version was better, or just was maybe better is the wrong word, but just it was more smooth. The graphics looked better. I mean, Street Fighter is a perfect example, right?
Yeah.
Like, people say the SNES version of Street Fighter 2 was way better. I guess better is the right word. Better overall than the Genesis version.
Yeah. No, I think that it's kind of these things that you don't really think about, and part of what was so fun about researching and writing the book, it's, these developers are working with pieces of hardware. Intrinsically, a piece of hardware is going to either be better, or maybe that's like a subjective term, but it'll be easier for them to program, or it'll work better for certain things. But by if you're working with a piece of hardware for a few years, you can optimize for it. And so what I was getting at was like Electronic Arts, EA with EA Sports, they had a very special, close relationship with Sega. So I think that is part of the reason too why they felt like they were able to maximize this. One of the funny things is, like, everyone I talked to from Sega, I interviewed over 200 people for the book, from all these companies. Almost everyone I talked to at Sega, at some point we talked about EA, and they would always kind of like wink at me and be like, "We're the reason that company's successful." And meanwhile, everyone I talked to at EA would kind of do the same thing and kind of wink at me and be like, "We're the reason that Sega's successful." So that was, I guess it was a symbiotic.
Which sports franchise was most important to them?
The Madden one.
The Madden one, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, on the Madden, it's so funny how the Madden one happened. It was originally a computer game for the Apple II, and it was unsuccessful. It was much more like a simulation game, because the guys at EA, they were all just like such awesome dorks. They were like sports dorks. They wanted to do, like Sims, but they ended up making more of like an arcade-style game. Madden wasn't involved mostly at all with that game, but they had the license from earlier, so they put his name on it, and to this day, his legacy grows from that, and he's certainly contributed over the years. But it was just funny how
I can't imagine John Madden being in these meetings, being like, "No, I don't like that sprite," or "No, that code is wrong. That if loop is incorrect." Like, I wonder how involved he was in the entire process, or was it just the licensing of his name?
From what I understand, the original game was purely the licensing of his name, because actually the original version, and there was a big court battle recently about this. So there was an original Apple II version that was a computer game, and computer games were not very popular with the mainstream audience back in the 80s. It was very much a niche, stereotypical Dungeons and Dragons, Mother's Basement type of crowd, because most people played the NES, the mainstream gamers at the time. And so they had this game that was not that successful. That one certainly does not withstand the test of time, the original John Madden Football. And then they developed a different game that was supposed to be much more arcade-like, that was not involved with John Madden at all, but to help market it, I believe it was like a meeting at Toys R Us, and the guys tried the game. They're like, "This is good, but you need to put a celebrity on it." And EA thought, well, we had this license with John Madden.
So the NFL trademark was not enough. It had to be somebody who was a celebrity in the football space in order to sell copies.
Yeah,
that's interesting.
Yeah, and maybe it's just because maybe that really wasn't the case, and marketers just thought that was the case, or maybe it was kind of what we were talking about earlier, where in a world where there's like little information and it's so hard to hook people who don't even know what these games are, that maybe they needed that.
And that happened in hockey too. I mean, there is Mario Lemieux hockey, Brett Hull hockey, Wayne Gretzky hockey, but the EA version was always just NHLPA or NHL. Like,
right.
Was that ever discussed?
Well, I think, in the 80s, EA, even when they were making computer games, it was very much like they also had Magic Johnson versus Larry Bird game. They had a Dr. J game, I believe. So they were much more into the athletes and using that as the marketing hook. And again, the original Madden license was from the 80s.
Yeah.
But part of the reason why I think EA Sports took off and why it was so appealing to people like you and I was that it gave us that fun and adrenaline rush of feeling like we are running a team or we are playing in the league. And so getting the logos of the teams and actually having the real players with the ratings, like that became much more important than saying Mario Lemieux's hockey. And almost in a way, I grew up in New York, so I was a Rangers fan just by default. I'd rather not have Mario Lemieux hockey, or I'd rather have like Mark Messier hockey. It's almost off-putting potentially. And that was also another reason too why I think NHL '94 was popular, at least personally or anecdotally. With the Rangers winning the cup, and all the excitement around hockey among people who weren't usually that interested. People like myself that were sports fans, but not necessarily hockey fans. Everything kind of converged for that game. In hearing this whole marketing methodology, I can't believe Tecmo Bowl is not called Bo Jackson Football. Yeah, right? Exactly.
Like, he owns the game.
Yeah.
It's impossible to stop him in the game.
Yeah. Well, and it's like, I haven't talked that much about this because I don't even know if there's much merit to it, but I do feel like the way that we, this quest for like authenticity, for having the real player numbers and the real logos and especially like the ratings. Like, I was so nerdy, I would get into like this player has a, Lemieux has a higher rating than Messier and all that stuff. Like, I feel like that did kind of make our generation a little bit more open to the idea of like Sabermatics and also the fantasy sports.
That's a good point.
Yeah. And I was thinking about that because what you're saying with Bo Jackson, people remember Bo Jackson as a legendary football player, and there's no question about his talent, but he only played a couple of years, and but I feel like so many of us remember him being incredible at that game that he takes on this like Herculean myth.
It's interesting you mentioned the rankings, right? Because the biggest example to me is Jeremy Roenick, right? I think it was it 93 or 94 where he had a 95 rating. He was tied with Lemieux. He was the highest rated overall player in the game. And he was the best player in the game. Like, him and Lemieux were basically neck and neck, and he might have been even faster in the game than Lemieux was. And I'm not saying that wasn't the case in the NHL that year, but to me it seemed like an exception to the rule, right? Like, right. It was almost like, wow, that took you aback for a second. Lemieux, you would put up there.
Right.
But Jeremy Roenick, and don't get me wrong, he's my favorite player. I love Jeremy Roenick.
Right.
But to give him a 95, I mean, I was like, this is interesting. And then I guess it sort of got me thinking about how you would rank players. So that's a very good point about how like people you get turned into
and
analytics.
so imagine being one of the guys at these companies.
Oh, that's stressful.
Like the ratings essentially started as just a bunch of sports nerds wanting to kind of be like, well, this quarterback's better than that guy. We should give Randall Cunningham or the QB for the Eagles speed. Like not necessarily trying to be reflective of reality, but kind of just for their own personal fantasy gaming aspect. But I guess what I find fascinating is like, these video games are like a derivative of the real sport, and you think like it's a step down. It's these guys, it's fans making a game is really what I'm trying to say. You don't think that much about the people. You don't ever think that you're going to cross paths with the people that you're making the game about, or that they will even care what you're doing. But the players started to get really into these games and also started to take notice of things like how they were rated, and that still exists today. A lot of, because there's so much concentrated downtime on sports teams, and they're often together. Playing Madden is not uncommon for athletes, or playing their respective games. And one of the stories I always really loved was from Michael Brook, who was the producer of the NHL '94 game and many of the titles in the NHL series. He told me this story about he had brought the game to the NHL Players Association licensing meeting in 1993, I believe, and like just to like let them play to make sure that it reflected their logos and everyone was happy with it. And then coming out of the meeting is this big, beefy bruiser of a guy, Ken Baumgartner, this enforcer, and he says to Michael, he's like, "Are you the guy from EA?" "Yeah, I'm Ken Baumgartner." And Michael's like, "Yeah, I know. I worship you, or you're like, you do for a living what I would love to do." And he's like, "Yeah, I'm the guy you gave 0 intelligence rating to." And it was like one of his most embarrassing moments. He thought Ken was going to slug him. Fortunately, Ken was a nice guy. And they ended up actually changing it from intelligence to awareness.
So was Ken Baumgartner still a 0 in awareness? I wonder if he was still a 0 awareness in that game.
I don't know the answer. We should probably find out.
I'd love to know. It got changed to a 10?
Yeah. Well, but like, and that kind of goes back to what you're saying about Jeremy Roenick. Excellent player. Nobody would argue that. But is he Lemieux level? Maybe somebody at EA was just a fan of the Blackhawks. I don't know. It's like these people,
Because there wasn't like a standardized format to give these ratings. People were literally debating them in the office. Is that how it happened? Yeah, okay.
Yeah, and like, make no mistake, like the world's eyes weren't on this, especially in the way it is now, where we're voting on who's going to be on the cover of Madden, and it's actually, the ranking, the like ratings get released, and it's a sort of a public event amongst that community. Like back then, it just felt like a bunch of guys in an office screwing around talking about this thing they loved. So I think that they just didn't realize the impact that it was going to have on a generation, and also on the players that they were making these games based on.
So you mentioned you wrote an article about NHL '94, and you have some deep knowledge into the creation of the game. You talked to the producers, you talked to the people behind the game. What were some of the things you learned about that game?
It's a good question. One of the things that was really interesting, a lot of people mistakenly remember, or at least remember, the moment in the movie Swingers where they make Wayne Gretzky bleed, and they think of that as the NHL '94. That was the NHL '93, the NHL PA game.
NHL '94 did not have blood.
Right, NHL '94 did not have blood, and you're like, oh, why did it not have blood? People loved it. Vince Vaughn loved it, and the reason was, the original version, which was I think just called NHL Hockey. Michael Brook, the guy I had mentioned earlier, the producer, he brought the game to the Stanley Cup Finals that year to kind of hobnob with the NHL execs and kind of show like this cool product. And everyone loved it, except that one of the guys in the luxury box where they were playing this game was like psyched because he was able to get Wayne Gretzky into a fight, let alone even with blood. and the commissioner at the time, I don't remember who was the commissioner. John
Ziegler, the president?
Yeah, John Ziegler.
Okay.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, so John Ziegler like saw that, and the mood in the room just like dropped. Like, you can't put our marquee player fighting. Like, enforcers fight. Players like Wayne Gretzky would never fight. So that led to the NHL not wanting to license the logos and everything for the 93 game, which is why the 93 game has the players, but not the NHL.
And it's just the city names, and it's the
Right.
colors. Like Toronto will be white and blue, and
Exactly.
New York. And actually, the Islanders are Long Island, I think, in that game.
I don't recall. I will take your word for it.
I'm
But yeah, but
pretty
it was
sure.
like...
But that's right, because there's no logos, and it's NHLPA 93.
Yeah. So that license was based on the NHLPA, and they... and they went to town with it. You can make Wayne Gretzky bleed in that game. Anybody could fight. And actually, the NHL players, the NHLPA, their only request was, if you're going to have fighting, which you totally should, just make it look more realistic. And I guess the more realistic was to have blood. But then going into the game, the game that would become NHL 94.
It's funny you say that because. There's a prominent blogger, Sean McIndoe, his name is Down Goes Brown online. He did a breakdown of 93 versus 94 on Grantland, I think, back in the day. And and he says that the mechanics for the fighting in 93 are the best of all time in a hockey game. So that makes a lot of sense.
That makes total sense. And, again, this kind of fits what we were saying earlier, where these guys, they don't just necessarily look at this as like some derivative marketing product. Like, they take pride in this. They love that this game is out there being played by millions of kids like us that's featuring them. Like, they were probably very collaborative in trying to get the fighting correct and, really making this game the best that it can be. And then for the 94 game, taking our listeners back in time, our younger listeners who maybe don't recall, there was this really hot buzzword at the time, multimedia. And it was like, 93, 94, computers were becoming more mainstream. Everything was going to be on CD-ROM, and it was like the whole world was going to converge. And so EA had these like big aspirations. Also, the founder of EA left to start 3DO, which was like this multimedia console company. So they wanted to make sure they have the NHL rights because they wanted to do CD-ROM games that would include like cutscenes from like actual game footage. So it was really important to have that relationship with the NHL again, and that's why there's no fighting in NHL 94.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
To preserve the relationship with the NHL.
Yeah.
But I mean, it's worked out well for them because they're still creating games. So
yeah.
20, 30 years later, so.
Yeah, and like, EA Sports had that motto, if it's in the game, it's in the game. And that was really a testament to trying to capture the accuracy. Like, if there was something, to try to create as much as you can in a 16-bit game, the feel that you were like on the field or on the ice, they really wanted to try to have like every little detail. Like, a great example is, I apologize for not having the specifics because I wrote this article a long time ago, but
we'll actually link the article in the description of the podcast if people can see it.
So they had, for each individual team, they had different organ music. That was one of the things that was really nice about NHL 94. And
wouldn't it play in the middle of play too? Like in the third period, it would play while you're playing the game.
And there were some cities, there was one team where the organist incorrectly played a certain note during the game, and they asked, like, they fixed it. They're like, oh, but we fixed it for the game. And they said, and the EA guy said, no, we want it to be played incorrectly like the way it's played in the stadium because we want it to be like authentic. If it's in the game, if it's happening in the game, we want it to be in our game. So like that's the hyper sensitivity and specificity these guys had. But at the same time, one thing I kind of realized when I was going through it was this difference between accuracy and authenticity. Because another thing that you have in hockey is referees skating around, but in a 16-bit video game, that could potentially be like very claustrophobic to just have this guy. And so they didn't include that element. And there's other elements like that they didn't include where I don't feel like it was...
That's right. The referees would just pop up in a box if there was a penalty, be like, and there you'd hear a whistle, and then there'd be an image of the referee being like 2 minutes for slashing, and then
right, exactly. And so like I feel like it was never explicitly said this much, but it was almost like they wanted to create the authentic experience of what it's like to be a player. And a player, while conscious of the referee, isn't like thinking like, oh, look, there's a referee right next to my teammate. You see, it's like they wanted you to see what the players see and what they feel. And so the referees, in their opinion, would have just like gotten in the way, and maybe it would have been more accurate, but unlike the organ music, which actually captured the feel of what it was like to be there,
cool.
they really wanted to capture like the authenticity of these games.
So why has 94 in particular stood the test of time when they've had so many years after that, 95, 90, etc., to improve upon the game? Why is that one looked at as the one that has stood the test of time and being the absolute best?
Well, I came here with one question, and that was going to be my question for you. No, no,
great.
I don't know. I mean, I think it's like it goes back to stuff we were talking about earlier with just like the saturation of the number of people playing it, and where it was in the console cycle. The multimedia thing didn't happen in the way that people envisioned the future happening at the time, but like a year after that or 2 years after that, there was Sega Saturn, there was Sony PlayStation. Games became a little bit more lifelike and a little bit less cartoonish. And I think it's hard to say that the games haven't gotten better every year. I mean, like, they do become more and more realistic.
Well, more involved, and definitely the graphics are better, and there's more features.
Like, technically, they do become better, but I think that
more robust. Sure, yeah.
Yeah, like it's almost. This is maybe like a poor analogy, but like that idea of like the uncanny valley, where we want our creations, our digital creations, to look more and more lifelike, and to the point where they get too lifelike, but they're not yet human, and then they are off-putting. And so, like, it's almost...
It reminds me of, like, the N64 games where, like, people were blocks, but they looked like people, but then...
Right.
Or the hair was, like, pixelated, blocky, and...
So I think,
I get it.
If I had to, like, just, like, guess why NHL 94 in particular, I think that it was kind of like that perfect game right before it hit this certain feeling of, like, the games become more and more lifelike, but they no longer felt as much like an escape to play, or as much... maybe then we notice things that we can criticize more, and I think that it really was too just the timing in a lot of people's lives. And let's also say, like, it's a fantastic game. It's not it just happens to be
no doubt about it.
It
won Ice Madness, Blake.
Yeah.
Let me ask you this to generalize that, because I think one of the reasons, I think you and I both share this, that we love retro video games is because there were restrictions. Yeah. There were space restrictions on the cartridge. There were graphic restrictions, especially with the NES. 8-bit graphics. The famous story about Super Mario having a mustache so that it looked like he had a nose. Like that kind of stuff, right?
Right.
Like, to me, that's fascinating. It's like problem solving. Necessity, the mother of invention, right? Like, to create this world within the parameters that you have. When did that paradigm shift? When did it go from we work with what we got and we create the best thing possible to the possibilities in creating a video game are endless? When did that change?
Well, that's a really good question. I mean, I think that if you were to ask the people that were making it, they would say that that's still not the case. There's always some parameters, but certainly the ones with the challenges they face with creating an 8-bit game or a 16-bit game are much different than whatever limitations the developers feel now. I do think that one big leap that happened also around that time, like in '95, is you go from having cartridges to compact discs. So whether it's Sega Saturn or whether it's Sony PlayStation, there's a lot more space for these games, and I think that was kind of like the first wave of when that started to change, and then the rest is just like, like Moore's law of everything getting better, twice as good and half the cost. So, the graphics just getting continually better, or seemingly exponentially better. But, it definitely, if you talk to the developers for old Nintendo games or old Genesis games or Super Nintendo games, that's like something they'll talk about a lot, is trying to puzzle this thing together with such limited space, and necessity is often the mother of invention, and I think that, like, a lot of good things came from that, whether it's Mario's mustache or just other ways to kind of streamline things. I think these guys were very innovative.
Would you just to put a button on NHL 94, would you put NHL 94 in your list of greatest sports video games ever?
Yeah, I mean,
yeah.
To me, it's one of, like, a top 5 game of all time.
Top 5? Period?
Yeah, period.
Awesome.
Yeah, and it was actually what got me into writing Console Wars. A few, I guess now, like 5 or 6 years ago, my brother got me a Sega Genesis for my birthday, because that's what we had when we were kids. And I fired it up, and I ordered on eBay NHL 94, among other games. and that was the first one I played. And I thought that it would be just fun from like a nostalgic perspective, but the gameplay was still awesome, and that's what I didn't really expect. And that's really interesting to me. It's interesting too that the games from that era, not just the sports games, but the Mario games or the Sonic games and everything, really have withstood the test of time. And what I find fascinating is, like, I've spoken at a bunch of like high schools, or spoken even to college kids that are 12 years younger than us, and they talk about, especially the high school kids, it's weird because like they talk about having like nostalgia for the games from this era, but they didn't grow up during that era. So it's like, it's not nostalgia in the sense of like it reminds them of yearning for a better time.
They weren't there.
They weren't there, but it was like but I find it very amazing that those games from that era are still being played by that generation, or at least that some portion of that group is interested in those games.
Nintendo's helping, right? Like with NES Classics coming out, all these retro games are there.
Absolutely, they help. But
decent
like
price point.
But I have no nostalgic bone in my body for games for the Atari 2600.
Not at all. Agreed. Agreed.
Even if Atari came back with Atari Classics, I'd be like, no thanks.
Maybe Yar's Revenge. Yar's Revenge was pretty good.
No, there's some good ones.
That was a creative game. That was what's his name? Bushnell?
Yeah,
that was
Noel
his
Bushnell.
game, right?
No. It was it's the guy who put his initials in the game.
It was an Easter egg.
Yeah, it's an Easter egg.
I forget the guy's name now. I got it wrong. Anyway,
yeah,
that was a good game. But okay, so
if you were to pick Warshaw,
maybe someone will tell us on Twitter. Yeah. If you were to pick, the important games of our time, right? Like NHL '94. Let's put that in there because it was a groundbreaking sports game. But what other games would you put on that list?
Well, what is our time? Like games?
The games that, I guess I'm looking for a list that really shifted the paradigm. Like Super Mario Brothers is like the groundbreaking, paradigm-shifting game, rejuvenated the video game industry in the 80s, right?
Yeah.
It was in the depths of despair. Here comes Super Mario Brothers, and then it just created this paradigm shift of video games are cool again.
Right.
So there's that to me. What else would I put on there? Pac-Man, maybe?
Yeah, I think
what would be the list of those important video games of all time?
Sure, like the very oversimplified version of like the history of video games would be arcade games at first in the 70s, Pong, which was Atari and Nolan Bushnell, leading to games to popular arcade classics like Pac-Man and Frogger, and then using that success to bring video games into the home. And then the video game industry died in 1983, or at least the business side of it crashed. There was this oversaturation of games. Nintendo, as you said, resurrected it with outstanding titles like Mario. And then, my book talks a lot about Sega coming into the market with games like Sonic the Hedgehog and really changing what video games were. Also, for our younger listeners, there was a time when playing video games was completely a childish thing to do. I remember playing Mario with my father, and he's an awesome dad, so he played with me and my brother, but he did it in the way a parent would have a tea party with their child, where it was all right, I'm doing this for you, but this is very silly for me to be doing this. And so I think one of the great things that Sega did with Sonic and with licensing, more adult skewed games, especially the sports games, was made video games more of a mainstream form of entertainment. And then, I guess in terms of the mascot types of games, Crash Bandicoot was a huge success for the Sony PlayStation. And
isn't there a good example of that, Sega versus Super Nintendo with Mortal Kombat? The Sega version had blood, the Super Nintendo version didn't.
Yeah, great example. Not even with Wayne Gretzky involved, but yeah,
Wayne Gretzky's fatalities, he scores 10 goals on any game.
Exactly. Yeah, one of the climaxes in the business battle between Sega and Nintendo was the release of Mortal Kombat. It was rare in that time that a game would be released on both systems in the same day. Usually they were exclusive titles or they were developed in-house, but Mortal Kombat was going to be released by Acclaim on the same day on both systems. It would kind of be the true test of which system is better, which kids on the schoolyard should be walking around strutting. And
interesting.
The Sega version kept the blood in the game, which was the arcade version, but Nintendo sanitized it and turned it into a greenish sweat, and also just tried to tamp down the violence.
I remember Kano. So Kano's fatality was rip the heart out of the chest and hold it in the air, right? But in Super Nintendo, it was almost just like a chest punch.
Yeah.
He punched you in the chest, held his hand in the air with nothing in it, And that was the, quote, fatality, unquote.
Yeah.
It was just so weird.
Sega outsold them 5-1. The funny thing to me is that always, like, you would think that what they lost in sales, because they lost a ton, and they knew they would lose a little bit. I don't think they realized it would be that bad. But their reason for doing it was, like, they wanted to have, like, good morals. They wanted to, you know.
So that was the branding at the time. Nintendo was the family-friendly company, and Sega was the edgy company.
Yeah.
I don't want to give too much away because I want people to pick up your book because it's very fascinating. It dives deep into it. But even as a primer, like just to talk about some of this stuff, especially that era. So in the thick of things, like what was the pinnacle of this war between Sega and Nintendo? What year would that have been?
I mean, the Mortal Kombat came out in the fall of '93. I think that was kind of close to, you know, that was one climax in that story, because also that was in the fall, and then that December of '93 they started congressional hearings into violence in video games.
Interesting.
And it was, you know, it was technically like a global look at video games, but in a way it was very much with Sega in the crosshairs, because you had Nintendo, this company that would never dare have, you know, fatalities, graphic fatalities, or the blood, and then you had Sega, which was trying to expand what video games were, and that really gets to the core of what this battle between Sega and Nintendo is all about, and something that we see in a lot of different businesses. You know, there's a lot of parallels between Nintendo and Apple, with just being very controlling, and having like a closed ecosystem, and that bothering some people, but also creating a stronger, more controllable user experience for them. So, you know, Sega tried to challenge Nintendo by offering what Nintendo didn't, and their offering was freedom. They wanted developers to make games for kids, teenagers, adults, senior citizens, whatever. And as a result of that, you get bloodier games. They had Sega CD. That was part of the Senate hearings too. There was like college girls dressed in like skimpy outfits. That was a big deal during these Senate hearings.
The digitized?
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Wow. Okay.
And there was one with, so
crazy.
like
Okay.
all that was going on at the time. But, you know, at the end of the day, it really does come down to the quality of the games. In terms of like the big turning point games, like we were saying earlier, for that battle, what really turned the tide back in Nintendo's favor was Donkey Kong Country. That was...
and why is that?
It was just light years ahead of any other game. Nintendo.
So when it came down to it, it was the gameplay, it was the interesting... It was just the interest of the game, regardless if it had violence or not. Donkey Kong Country was so fun that...
Right.
Okay.
And like, you know, it wasn't just the fun, which it was very fun, but that was an example where like the graphics were so much better. It had like a 3D look to it, and really started to pave the way for the games we would later see with polygons, with like, you know.
So how did Sega not... I mean, Sega Genesis and Super Nintendo... Who won that era? The 16-bit, like Sega Genesis versus Super Nintendo. If you were to crown a winner, who would it be?
I think it really matters in like what time you're going to crown the winner. I mean, I guess you're asking like today.
Well, no, today Nintendo wins because they've stand tall,
Right.
and Sega's creating games on Nintendo platforms now, right? Like now
exactly.
you see Mario and Sonic at the Olympics.
Which is blasphemy to me.
Yeah, right? Like they're together. How did this happen? But like in that time.
It's a really good question because it's an interesting question. Like the premise of my book is very much written for a mainstream audience. It's a story like Moneyball. It's sort of this like social network of video games type story, but this is an underdog story. And Sega had less than 5% of the market in 1990. And even more significantly, just Nintendo was video games, to the extent that they literally took out ads to say that Nintendo does not mean video games. The words are not synonymous in the way that
That's your pinned tweet on your Twitter account.
That was becoming
It is not a Nintendo.
Yeah. I mean, my mom still calls every video game a Nintendo. But
but it was such good branding, right? Like not every
like it's Jacuzzi
cotton
or
swab
Kleenex.
is a Q-tip.
Yeah, like it was like
Right.
Nintendo was so successful that it was getting to the point where that was just what Nintendo was video games. So like the fact that Sega even made a dent, let alone took the lead with Mortal Kombat and you know up until like '95 had outsold Nintendo. Like I feel like it would be weird to crown Nintendo the champion of that era because Nintendo did so much worse than they ever expected. Sega showed that this industry could be bigger than one company, paving the way for Sony and for Microsoft and all that. But at the end of the day, Nintendo has always been focused on playing like this long game and kind of doing things the Nintendo way, and it has worked out for them, even though at times will be upset with their choices, whether it's stuff for the Wii U, whether it's GameCube. At the end of the day, Nintendo does have fantastic games, and that's always what has, I don't want to say saved them, because it's not like they're in true danger, but they do make excellent games.
So beyond the 16-bit systems, how did Nintendo, like you said, stood the test of time? They've gotten through every generation, but why didn't Sega? What went wrong for them?
Well, not to spoil too much of the book, but
Okay.
as somebody who read it, it's a long book. It's an epic story of corporate battle. But going into it, I just assumed that the most interesting battle would be between Sega and Nintendo, but it turned out to be between Sega of America and Sega of Japan, and kind of this cultural divide. And so I think that it plays a large part in why Sega doesn't exist today in the way that we remember. And essentially, they're no longer in the hardware business. They are purely software and will do blasphemous things like PAL together with Mario.
You do talk about Sonic the Hedgehog in the book, but can you give us a cliff notes on how Sonic was created?
Sure. So, given the success of Nintendo and the popularity of Mario with, first appearing in Donkey Kong and then his own series, and then Super Mario 2 and Super Mario 3 and the movie The Wizard showing off Super Mario 3, everyone knew that to challenge Nintendo, even to just get 10% of the market or whatever, you needed your own mascot character. So Sega very consciously was trying to create one. Their first mascot character was a kid character named Alex Kidd. That did not work out so well. And so they actually held
wasn't it like, if I recall, wasn't he the skateboard? He was on the skateboard?
I think that was the Island game, maybe.
Oh, that was Hudson's Adventure Island.
Adventure
that's right.
Island, yeah.
No, wrong game.
But yeah,
Anyway,
but he actually, there was like a lot of similarity with that game. But
Okay.
but yeah, I mean, so Sega held this mascot competition, and there was like rabbits and bears and all these things, and they ended up selecting a little hedgehog named Mr. Needlemouse. That evolved into Sonic the Hedgehog. And a lot of the story...
Was Mr. Needlemouse the name of the person that drew it? So this was a fan
No.
that drew? Oh, okay.
I think Needlemouse means hedgehog in Japanese.
But this was a fan submission, though?
Oh, no, sorry. It was an internal
company.
company.
It was within the company.
Yeah,
okay,
sorry.
okay.
Yeah, it was within the company.
And whoever drew it in the company named it Mr. Needlemouse?
Right.
Okay, got it.
And that ended up becoming Sonic the Hedgehog. And I think that, a lot of the book and a lot of video games or any product in general is marketing related, and I used to think of marketing as like a dirty word, but I think it's actually more about sharing the story and vision of your company. But I mention this because, like, I don't know, when hearing about a mascot competition and trying to create your own Mario, it kind of reminds me of like that Simpsons episode with Poochie, where it's like, like these old guys in a boardroom thinking like they know what's cool. But why Sega was so successful was largely because of that great game that the developers in Japan made and the great marketing of the people in America who were able to take Sonic and not make him a Poochie, not make him the cool hedgehog that you have to own, but they actually gave him a personality. And there hasn't been a great Sonic game in decades, but I like even today on the subway I saw a kid wearing a Sonic shirt. I'm like, why do you like Sonic? How do you even know Sonic? But they created a character that could withstand the test of time, and that's the greatest legacy of that era. I think.
Still play 2 and 3 on the regular. Like, I'll pop it in every now and then. Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
It is fun. It's fast, right?
Yeah.
And that was the other thing, was that like Mario was decent speed, but then Sonic came along and was like super fast.
Yeah, I mean,
everything moved at
Sega
breakneck
totally
speed.
tapped into that whole zeitgeist of the early mid-90s with like MTV
Yeah.
and In Your Face and X Games becoming popular. So like, whereas Mario was about exploring and collecting coins and maybe like, let me see what's over that cliff. Sonic was all about just like, I'm gonna go as fast as I can, dude. How fast can you do this? Can you beat me? Can you catch me? Can you stay with me? And he had this attitude, and they made the battle very interesting.
So we won't spoil much more about this battle because it's all in your book, Console Wars. I highly recommend, like I said, people picking it up because it's very, very interesting. Also available in audiobook, which is how I consumed it, which I appreciate because it's nice to be able to listen to a book while you're driving around.
The guy, Fred Berman, the narrator, did an awesome job.
Yeah, he did.
I wrote the book. I always say, like, with my grandma in mind, I wanted to write a video game book that would be as appealing to a hardcore gamer as it would my grandma. And so, like, how could I get her to care about these things? And it was about making it about these people and their passion and their ideas. And so, it intentionally reads very much like a movie or like you're in the room with these people. And so I think that when Fred, as the narrator, like, I think the audiobook works fantastic because he does a great job of making you feel like you're there.
A couple more video game related questions for you. If you were to pick an era, 8-bit, 16-bit, whatever it is, that in your opinion produced the best series of games, which era would that be?
I mean, it would be. I would think it would be biased just because.
Yeah,
it would certainly be down to the.
But you also have a lot of
16-bit.
research behind you, and you also have seen what games are popular in what generations, which consoles, etc. So, which ones would you? Which era or generation would you say was created the best pound for pound list of titles?
Like as a library of titles,
yeah.
I would say the 16-bit era. But just in terms of like the specialness and the withstanding the test of time, I would say the 8-bit era. I mean, look at how many of those. I mean, it's mostly Nintendo because Nintendo owned the market. But whether it's Mega Man or whether it's Super Mario or Zelda or Donkey Kong, like all these intellectual properties and all these franchises were birthed during that time. And as we said earlier, it's not like, oh, they were good for the time, but now nobody cares. Like, those games have withstood the test of time for a reason. Like, Nintendo makes excellent games that do withstand the test of time.
What's your favorite game of all time? Do you have one?
I mean, all my Sega executive friends who I interviewed for the book would kill me, but it's Mario 3.
Mario 3, yeah.
Yeah, I mean,
they would never admit that. All the Sega executives wouldn't say that.
What would they say? They would tease me for being like a Mario fanboy.
Really?
Well, and because like anyone who read
but then
the book,
when you say Sonic 3 or Sonic and Knuckles, they'd be like, "That's right! What a great choice!"
Yeah, I mean, I think it like comes down to, like I said earlier, I'm not fantastic at video games. Yeah. I am also like, you see me. I'm like wearing shorts. I'm kind of like slow moving. I'm like much more of like a Mario person in my life, where I'm just like. Like, let me like move slowly and like make observations. I'll collect some coins. I'll steal some coins from your office today. Like, the speed of Sonic, especially to somebody who's not great at gaming like me, like I couldn't keep up. And also, I like to find the nuances. But that doesn't make Sonic not an excellent game. It just means that Mario to me is.
Did you ever dive deep into, I remember watching videos on this or interviews with the creators of Mario, especially the later releases, like how they structured each level. There was like a learning process to it. It was like, in one level, we're going to introduce a different type of peril, and the first time you see it, it's a learning process. So it's like, the first time you encounter this obstacle, you won't die, but you're going to learn how to overcome it, and then the next 3 times it's almost like each level is its own story itself.
Yeah, and Nintendo is great at that. There's a really great documentary called Indie Game, which is about developers who make games for not studio budgets, but that are released on like iPhones or Xbox Live and stuff like that. And there's the creator of a game called Super Meat Boy talking about that and kind of how you have to.
Super Meat Boy?
Yeah.
What's the premise of that game?
I don't know. Look it up.
Okay, I will. Fine. I guess I will. Super Meat Boy. What a great name.
Yeah. But that's like a really good look at somebody going through that process of like, you come up with this cool game mechanic, but you can't just be like, here, audience, do this.
Yeah.
And Nintendo has given us a template, of how to find that precision. So yeah, I mean, that's definitely something they do. And it's also interesting too, like, I remember talking to somebody, they were saying that the difference between an American developer and a Japanese developer during that time period was the Japanese developers would come up with a game mechanic and then base the story around that. Whereas the American developers would come up with like a story or like what they wanted to happen in a level, and then figure out the mechanics to make that work. So
interesting.
I feel like there's some metaphor there about how Americans love myth making and storytelling, and Japanese developers care about the technical finesse and work that way.
So one more question about the past, and we'll move on to the future. Purely selfish, because I have a definite answer on this. In your opinion, which NES series had the best music? or game. Do you have a definitive answer on this?
No, I don't have I mean, I always really
I have
liked
a
the Mega
definitive
Man
answer.
stuff.
That's my definitive
Okay.
answer.
Yeah.
I think it's not even close, and people debate me on this all the time.
Yeah.
I get it. The Super Mario music is iconic. I'm not saying that any Mega Man song comes close in popularity to the Calypso Super Mario
But like through
song.
and through, I mean, it's so.
But the library, I don't see how Mega Man gets touched. I think it's outstanding composition.
Yeah. Well,
So that,
I mean, I
that's
guess,
my answer. I just
guess
wanted
we're on
to
the
know if
same
you had
page,
one.
yeah.
We're on the same page, so we can move on. So
Yeah.
you're writing a book now about virtual reality.
Yeah.
So tell me about that. Tell me about that process, and tell me about what you're learning about VR.
I mean, again, you know, as I did with Console Words, I want to write a book that my grandma could enjoy. It's a very different challenge to write about something while it's happening as opposed to 20 years after the fact. But my hope is that a book like this will make my grandma or my wife or anybody just more interested in VR and demystify it a little bit by showing the faces behind the scenes, the people that are making this happen. And so, you know, the story of modern VR, of Oculus and of what led to the HTC Vive and the PlayStation VR and all this stuff really started 5 years ago with a kid named Palmer Luckey, this 19-year-old kid who was building headsets in a trailer that he was living in, and
Wow.
you know, whereas the rest of the world had thought that the VR fad was over and that VR was dead, you know, he was really interested in retro consoles and retro gaming, and wanted to try to make it work. I mean, it has worked in the past. VR, it just wasn't very good.
I don't know if I'd call Virtual Boy a success.
Oh, it was a huge failure. But like, you know, around the time that you know, you and me were hearing about how multimedia was the future, so was like virtual reality. There was
Fair.
like Dactyl Nightmare and these setups in the malls, and you know, VR was a really hot buzzword and a really hot source for money, and then a huge failure in the 90s. And so, you know, and that also wasn't the first time that VR as like an industry, as a consumer industry, had failed. And I make that distinction because, you know, whereas virtual reality seems to have like been resurrected or kind of come out of nowhere these past 5 years, you know, it did exist in some university settings. It was used in some ways by the military. Like, it's not like VR completely died, but consumer VR is really what I'm talking about. Like you and I, like that we would actually buy a headset, that it's a somewhat affordable headset, whether it's a $100 mobile headset or whether it's a $600 Oculus Rift, you know, that we would buy this thing and be able to play games and have these experiences.
So in your opinion, will we come to a time where, let's use Mario as an example. Am I going to see a Super Mario VR in the next 5 years where I'm literally in the Mushroom Kingdom and I'm jumping on Goombas and I'm throwing fireballs at Bowser? Like, is this going to happen?
I would say absolutely. I mean, the only asterisk there is just because it's Nintendo, and Nintendo is such a, you know, Nintendo does things their way. So they own the property of
Sure.
Mario.
So once they get
yes.
once they
like
once
whether
they adopt VR.
But like I think that but like exactly what you're saying is the answer conceptually is yes. And whether it's Mario or whether it's the Star Wars universe or whether it's any of these other classic properties that you know that we all loved watching or playing, I think that we're going to be able to spend time in them. And we're, you know, my interest in VR didn't necessarily come from a gaming place. It came from the potential of like the social interaction. And you know, around the time, so Oculus was founded by this teenager, Palmer Luckey, in 2012, in the summer of 2012, and then in March 2014, so almost 2 years later, him and the guys who had built this company with him, they sold it to Facebook for $2 billion. And so that caught my interest and a lot of people's interest. Like, why would Facebook? They're not a gaming company. Up until that point, it had always been perceived as a gaming thing. And around that time, I was also reading a great book by Ernest Cline called Ready Player One, which...
oh, it's a fiction tale, right?
Yeah, and it's being... Spielberg is directing a movie
right.
that's coming out in March of next year. And that was just... I love that book, but that book was also a huge inspiration for many of the people I've been interviewing for why they wanted to get into VR. It kind of showed what the long-term vision of it can be, where it speaks of a future, I think it's the year 2044, where people spend like at least half their life in a virtual world, and I think that
that's frightening.
It's frightening, but it's also, it's not like playing games in a virtual world. It's
Isn't that like basically being in a sim? Like Second Life, or what is that called?
Yeah.
Like basically that, but you see everything.
Oh, do you not think we're in a sim right now? Because Elon Musk would.
Oh, okay.
No, but
this is getting way philosophical
but I
now.
think a better way to think about it. No, I know. I think whether it was half your life or whatever, it was almost like, it was like the internet 2.0. It's like maybe the idea of spending half of our life in a virtual simulation seems off-putting, dystopian even, but I guess I don't spend half my day online, but I spend several hours, and it's more of just like a physical manifestation of that, and being in this place.
I guess you have a point, though. I mean, we spend so much time on our phones, right? Like, I mean,
Right.
we've been talking on this podcast, and I haven't checked my phone, and this is probably the longest in this entire week that I haven't gone checking my phone.
Right, and so it's like that, and it's also, there's also augmented reality, which is like
Nintendo's big on that, right? Augmented reality. Like, that's basically what the Switch is.
No, it's not
not
yet. No,
Not yet? Okay.
Pokemon Go is kind of augmented reality, though some might debate. But it's
okay.
like I think a good example of augmented reality is like Terminator vision. So it's like I look at you, and if let's say I was wearing translucent glasses, and things come up that like shows me your Facebook profile, or says like here's things you like, or here it'll tell me. It's basically looking at like a dashboard of your life.
I was confused. I watched a video from a gaming YouTube series, and their theory is that the Switch will be...
Yes, that is what some people
Sorry.
think that...
Okay, so that's what I thought.
That it will lead to augmented reality. And really...
Which would be pretty cool, actually.
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of where, like, the idea of I'm going to exit this real world and spend time in a virtual world for 5 hours a day, 2 hours a day, that sounds kind of like dystopian. But then the idea of putting on a pair of glasses that can let me, if I want, block out the rest of the world, or it can just show me, information like augmented reality. If it's the same pair of glasses, that is a little bit more normal. That's almost just like an evolution of our phones.
Okay.
So and we're my poor grandma, she keeps coming up, like coming back to her.
She's famous at this point.
She's famous, yeah. Like, not only like the social thing is really what interested me, and we can get into it when we talk about like the future of the sports.
And that's what I want to end on, yeah.
The idea of like when you're talking about the Mushroom Kingdom and the idea of like being there instead of playing it with the screen between you and Mario. What's more interesting to me, maybe because I'm the Mario type that just, little explorer guy, I like the idea of just hanging out in the Mushroom Kingdom as opposed to like playing a game where I have to achieve objectives. And so if I was going to have a call with my grandma every week, maybe it'd be better to do it for us to both be in this virtual place, whether it's the Mushroom Kingdom, or maybe she wants to take me on a walk through a street of Italy where she went with my grandpa on their honeymoon.
That's fascinating.
It's the social aspect of it too, and getting into the sports things like.
So let's set the table for that. That's what I want to end on here. Is the idea of virtual reality, even augmented reality, and the consumption of sports. So in your opinion, will we ever get to a situation where I can be at home, I have a virtual reality setup, and it has essentially replicated the entire experience of being in a seat in the arena?
Yes. I mean,
and how soon is this coming, or is it already here?
It's already here it's already here, but it's not a perfect experience. But like even when Mark Zuckerberg purchased Oculus back in 2014, his message, his Facebook post was about how he wanted one day for anybody to be able to attend a basketball game and feel like they're there. And that also kind of gets into some of the philosophical things. People think that like VR and AR is like a moral imperative because some people can't afford going to a basketball game. There's a lot of things we can't afford, but in a virtual world where everything is digital, you can potentially like afford anything and experience anything.
This is fascinating. So I wonder if sports teams will purchase this and sell that and make it, you know what I mean? Like, hey, you may not be able to afford the excuse me, you may not be able to afford the multi-$1,000 courtside seat, but for $30, $40 or whatever the price point is, here's your virtual reality ticket, and you can now sit there and watch it. I wonder if that's going to become a thing, or is it just you can experience it? Like, it's going to get so good.
To me, that would be the kind of thing I would want to purchase.
Yeah.
I think that there are
Especially
companies
in the playoffs,
now,
like the Rangers are going into the playoffs right now. Imagine you're a Rangers fan and you're watching the game from the glass.
Right, and like the cool thing to me is not that is cool to feel like you're there, but it's like my brother lives in Colorado. I would love, I'm a pretty passive hockey fan, but I would love to watch to go to the Rangers
as if you're
game
sitting
with
beside
my brother.
each other.
And so if you can actually add the social component, and he's right next to me, and then maybe even add haptic feedback to the touch controls so we can high five, and you actually feel like, wow, like something just happened when the Rangers score, when
wow, yeah,
there's an awesome check or like anything. And so that's the part that is very intriguing to me.
And all of this is already here, like even the physical part of it.
Not yet.
Not yet.
So where we're at right now, with just not related to sports, for the just consumer VR, is there's hand controls, and like there's avatars to represent you. It's again, it kind of goes to that uncanny valley thing where it's not you exactly, but what's cool about the VR is because you're wearing a headset. If you turn your head like 1/8 of an inch to the left, the avatar moves 1/8 of an inch to the left. So like the mannerisms feel real. So one of the recent demos that I had, one of the demos I had at Oculus was I'm in one room, the guy giving me the demos in another room, but we played ping pong together. And it's like,
that's cool.
And it actually felt like we were together. It didn't,
that's cool.
And he handed me a block from this virtual table.
Wow.
And I took it. And so, that's the kind of thing where it's hard to experience that, which is in itself pretty cool, and not to like extrapolate and think about my brother in Colorado and my grandma and you and I and like, I think that's when you throw in the possibility of sports, which at the end of the day, what makes sports matter so much is really the social aspect. Like it's because we all care. It's because I grew up loving the Yankees with my parents, and that's why I always had that special place in my heart. So to be able to enjoy it with them, I think is what's so cool. And it's, and even in like a low pressure way, because driving to Yankee Stadium sometimes would be tough, or driving up to my parents, or getting everyone together at the same time. But if you can just sit in a game in the stands with somebody, or feel like you're there, and then say like, hold on, I'm gonna go to the bathroom, and just take off your headset for 2 minutes and then come back, like it's just, there's so much ease to that. And that still doesn't necessarily, it doesn't beat being there, not yet, maybe down the line.
That's what I want to end this on. I want to know, in your opinion, based on everything you know about VR, what you've researched, what will be in this upcoming book, and where things are going. Do you think we will ever get to a time where the virtual reality experience will be so close or even exceed the in-game, in-person experience that people will choose to simply consume in VR as opposed to going to the games themselves?
I mean, I don't mean to like deflect the question and throw it back to you, but I kind of have a question. Like, what do you think drives people to come to Madison Square Garden now? Because, especially like with football, like a lot of people prefer to watch the game at home because you can watch multiple games and because it's just
some
easier.
Sports are much better to watch on a broadcast.
I mean, I guess
Agreed.
hockey is,
for sure.
even
hockey
as someone,
is a sport that you got to consume live, for sure. I love being in the arena watching hockey. Football, I can consume at home. I don't need to go to the stadium and watch football. In fact, actually my overall experience is a little bit worse unless it's a fantastic game and the weather is good. All these factors, right? But to me, I don't know. I feel like based on what you're saying and the technology, way everything is going, I could totally envision a situation where I feel like I am at the arena and I have the headset on and I feel like I can touch the person beside me, I can high five them like you said, and all the sounds are correct and I literally feel like I'm there. I mean, short of buying something at concession, I'm basically a part of the experience. And how much did I pay for that experience, other than the hardware?
Right.
Right.
No, I think that's
I'm
definitely...
really wondering. I really wonder if we're going to get to that point, especially for big prize. It's funny. There's a Holyfield Lewis poster up on the wall right now where we are. Prize fights, perfect example. So the UFC fights, or those big once every 4-month events, right?
Yeah. No, I definitely think that that's coming soon and where we're headed, and not in like a bad way, because You're right. Hockey is one of the sports where it's certainly better to be there. I said it earlier. I'm like a passive hockey fan, but I would always say yes to a hockey team.
You were there when Gretzky retired.
Yes.
What was that like?
It was cool. I was also, I don't know why, because we were like, I don't know, 40 rows back. It was not like I was that close, but his wife was like sitting right next to us.
Really?
So that was
Janet
more,
was right there?
Yeah,
Wow.
that was more interesting to me.
What was she? She must have been in tears.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That was the more interesting thing to me to like
Wait,
watch.
so did you get on TV? They must have cut to her.
Maybe. We got to get our
That's
footage.
Yeah, we got to check it out. There's like a young Blake there. Woo!
Yeah. It was really
Thank you,
cool.
Wayne.
I got choked up when they played that Time of Your Life Green Day song at the end.
Oh, yeah.
But yeah, I mean, that was, and like the thing that's so special to me, yeah, it was awesome. It was his last game, and it was awesome that Janet was there. But like going with my dad, that was the part that was like made it so special. And so, to be able to connect with, I think that's what is going to make the VR thing
once the
really
social
cool.
component,
because it's not just the replication of a lot of like the graphics and the audio. It is the ability to share it with somebody.
I think, like you said, that's true. If I can go with my brother who lives in Colorado and feel like we are exactly sitting beside each other at a game, I think that's going to go leaps and bounds. I think you're right. So when does this book come out on VR?
The book comes out early next year.
Awesome.
So I'm finishing it up as we speak, or I guess not as we speak, but yeah. it is.
You're working on it today, though. You have your laptop with you.
Yeah.
So you were working on it today. That's cool.
Yeah.
I like that. I like the idea of knowing that you were working on the book, and then you paused working on the book to do this podcast, and you'll probably go back to working on the book.
Yeah.
Awesome. And people can follow you on Twitter at Blake J. Harris, NYC.
They can.
Awesome. And pick up Console Wars, like you said, especially if you're interested in the battle between Nintendo and Sega in the early 90s, you have to pick up this book. It's a definitive look back on that time. And
Well,
Nintendo's
thanks so
still
much
here.
for having me on, man.
Appreciate it, man. This was fun.
Yeah.
So there it is, a fascinating conversation with Blake J. Harris. Thank you very much for listening. You can check out all of our previous podcasts on iTunes and msgnetworks.com. We've had some great guests. This has been a good run so far. It's only been about a month and a bit, and we're already past 10 episodes. Are you serious right now? We didn't even have a 10-episode celebration. What gives? We should have had a cake at msgnetworks.com. The past guests include Robert Karpelis, who is a lawyer with the Florida Panthers and has one of the greatest parody accounts on the internet, and also a former member of the WWE's creative team. NHL organist with the New Jersey Devils, Pete Canarozzi. Great conversation about what it takes to be an organist and musician for an NHL team. Dmitry Filipovich, a whiz when it comes to NHL numbers and analytics. He is one of the preeminent analytics guys in the NHL. Talking hockey, we give you an analytics 101. So that's a great conversation. If you're scared by numbers in hockey or even sports, listen to that podcast. Stray from the Path, a great heavy metal band. You know I love my metal. Tom Williams, the guitarist, is a huge Rangers fan. You got to listen to that episode. The keeper of the Stanley Cup, Phil Pritchard, the face of the Stanley Cup. If the Stanley Cup had a face and a voice in human form, it would be Phil Pritchard. We talk about all the crazy stories and places that the Stanley Cup has been, the dents, the typos, the scratches, the nicks, the travels, everything you can think of regarding the Stanley Cup. We talked to Ken Danico, Mr. Devil, Dano, my old friend, about his career, and I hope he writes a book. You got to listen to this podcast because at the end of it, you'll be thinking, man, Dano needs to write a book. We also have some behind-the-scenes MSG Hockey Show stories with Anson Carter and Will Reeve. We sat down after the very last episode of the season, and we just talked. We just hung out, and this is the kind of conversation you would hear the three of us have if the mics weren't on. So we peek behind the curtain on that one. And the former Rangers captain and current color commentator Dave Maloney was a guest last week as well. And you can check out this week's podcast with Lacey Mark, former Bachelor contestant, and the Maven, Stan Fischler, hashtag AskTheMaven. All of this is on iTunes and MSGNetworks.com, hashtag TheAPod. Monday's Arda's Words on the Blog was all about passionate fan bases, particularly Game 6 at Madison Square Garden in the first round, Rangers and Habs. But there were 3 other fan bases I wanted to give a shout out to because watching on television, sometimes games fall flat, but definitely not with these fan bases. So definitely check out that article is up on msgnetworks.com. And That's it. Thank you so much for listening. Thanks for subscribing on iTunes. Thanks for leaving a comment and a 5-star rating. We'll be back next week with 1 or 2 or 3 or more. I don't know how many episodes of the A-Pod, but definitely on Wednesday. That is the anchor day. So every Wednesday, you are guaranteed to get an episode of the A-Pod. And then beyond that, you may or may not get more. Have a great weekend, everyone.